Hello, welcome to PCAP's Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Rose and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. This afternoon, Dr. Pascal Badiou, Research Scientist with Ducks Unlimited Canada, Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research, will be presenting about prairie wetlands in a changing climate. Check out other events going on for Prairie's Got the Goods Week. Don't miss our next webinar, Wetlands, Flood Control and Ecosystem Services in the Smith Creek Drainage Basin, a case study in Saskatchewan, by Dr. John Pattison-Williams, Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology from the University of Alberta. That's today at 3:00 p.m. Tomorrow at noon, Dr. Edward Bork from the University of Alberta will be talking about does livestock grazing regulate soil carbon in northern temperate grasslands? To register for these webinars or to see the week schedule, please visit the PCAP website, www.pcap-sk.org. Prairie's Got the Goods Week is presented by Crescent Point Energy and SaskPower, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. We appreciate the ongoing support from Wildlife Habitat Canada. We would like to note that the primary source of funding for this grant program is from the purchase of the Canadian Wildlife Habitat Conservation Stamp, or the Canadian Duck Stamp, by waterfowl hunters. In-kind support for today's webinar has been given by Ducks Unlimited Canada. And a reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. I would like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Pascal Badiou. He has been a research scientist with Ducks Unlimited Canada Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research, IWWR, since 2006. Prior to joining Ducks, Pascal worked as an aquatic scientist specializing in water quality and aquatic ecology for an environmental consulting firm in Winnipeg. In general, Pascal's research interests focus on the ecology of wetlands and shallow lakes. He is particularly interested in how multiple stressors such as droughts, eutrophication, non-indigenous species, and pesticides interact to affect the ability of wetlands to enhance water quality and regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, Pascal is working in a number of prairie watersheds where he and his team are examining the impacts of wetland management practices, drainage and restoration on hydrology and water quality at large scales. Dr. Badiou has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science and a Ph.D. in Wetland Ecology from the University of Manitoba. He is an adjunct professor in the University of Manitoba's Department of Biological Sciences. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Pascal.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm hoping that you can now see my screen and hear me all right.
Yes, you're good.
Fantastic. Well, I want to start off by thanking PCAP and Caitlin for inviting me to give this presentation. While I'm interested in wetlands and climate change, I have actually never given specifically a talk just on climate change in prairie wetlands. And so this is a great opportunity for me to pull this material together. So this is the first time I'm giving this presentation. And the nice thing about giving a webinar like this is that you can change things on the fly. So I was able to insert my email address on the title slide here quickly before we got going. And that way, if any of the listeners have questions, comments, or suggestions on what I can add or delete from this presentation, I'm glad to hear them, because I will likely be giving this a number of times in the future to different groups, whether it's fundraisers, private landowners, corporations, and other researchers. So again, thank you very much. I also want to put in a plug for Dr. John Pattison's presentation that's coming up this afternoon on the Smith Creek watershed. In fact, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today feeds directly into some of the work that John has done. And so he'll be focusing a lot more on the co-benefits that wetlands provide, and obviously those will be impacted by climate change. So sorry, I'm just having some issues with my mouse here. There we go. So to get started, just a brief outline of the presentation I'm going to give today. I'm going to give a brief overview of climate change and some of the projections for the Canadian prairies. I'll talk a little bit about ramifications of climate change for prairie pothole wetlands specifically, and then I'll cover some of the potential for prairie pothole wetlands to adapt to and mitigate against climate change, and I'll end off with some conclusions and recommendations. And so again, I just want to let everyone know that I've pulled together a huge variety of data sources here. Hopefully, it's not overwhelming, and I have to give thanks to many of the other institutions and colleagues who have contributed slides to this material. So to start off with, I don't think we need to put a lot of emphasis on global temperature and some of the changes that we've been seeing, but global temperatures are increasing significantly and continue to rise. I apologize for this figure. I took it from a U.S. source from the Fourth National Climate Assessment, so the figure is actually in degrees Fahrenheit, but it does a really good job at showing the change in global land and ocean temperature anomalies, especially starting around the 1940s and continuing on to today. And if we look at the image on the right, showing the globe, we can see that a lot of these temperature anomalies and increases are occurring in temperate and Arctic regions. And really, it's well known that these increases in temperature are driven by human activities. So while temperature and global temperature can be affected by things like solar activity and volcanic activity, this graph does a really good job at quantifying the difference in terms of radiative forcing. And so we can see that the human-caused radiative forcing, mostly associated with greenhouse gas emissions, by far exceeds the warming associated with solar activity as well as volcanic activity. Now, another important thing to note here is that carbon dioxide concentrations today are now 33% higher relative to maximum concentrations recorded in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. So that alone is pretty significant evidence that we as humans have had a significant impact on our atmosphere. Now, a lot of people wonder how we ascertain this information and how we're able to go back 800,000 years and look at CO2 concentrations. And again, these are essentially taken from ice cores. So we look at the air trapped in ice cores and measure CO2 concentrations. And so here I'd like to thank a number of the slides I'm going to be presenting are actually from the Prairie Climate Center based here in Winnipeg and associated with the University of Winnipeg and the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Now, under these continued high carbon emissions, temperature in the Canadian prairies is expected to increase by up to 4 degrees Celsius by the year 2059. And so this is really significant. In fact, this would essentially produce a climate similar to what we currently see in northern Texas here in the Canadian prairies. Now, again, this is for the high projections. These would change depending on how many reductions in terms of greenhouse gases we can achieve over the next decade. Now, obviously, as soon as we start producing temperature changes, especially in an ecozone like the Canadian prairies, where we usually have anywhere from already arid to semi-arid conditions, this is going to have implications for our climate moisture index, or essentially the severity and frequency of droughts. So climate moisture index is really just measuring precipitation offset by potential evapotranspiration. And we can see that even with rapid emissions reductions, droughts are going to increase in the Canadian prairies and will become potentially catastrophic if we do nothing. So looking at this part of the figure here, this is again just a reference period. And this is the period, essentially, if we continue with high emissions, we can see that the climate moisture index decreases significantly for almost the entire prairie region. And even concerning here is even if we're able to achieve some fairly rapid emissions reductions, we're still going to see a fairly expansive growth in terms of drought conditions within the Canadian prairie region. Now, while the likelihood of more severe and frequent droughts will increase, on the opposite end, so will the prevalence of spring flooding. And this seems somewhat counterintuitive, but really what it comes down to is some of the variabilities in the extreme that we're going to experience, specifically with changes in how precipitation falls and when it falls. And so one of the things that Dave Sachin from the University of Regina and his research associates have been able to do is look at variations in winter precipitation based on dendrochronology. So essentially looking at past records from tree rings and projecting what that's going to look like going forward. And so on this figure, you can see that as we move from the year 2020 outward to 2100, we can see this dramatic variability in terms of total precipitation that's going to accumulate during winter. That's also punctuated by some fairly significant drought periods. And so again, we can experience these very wet springs and then alternating essentially with summer drought periods. And a really good example of this was actually the year 2011. So in 2011, we had fairly expansive spring flooding right across the prairies. And then within a few short weeks, by early summer, we started entering into a fairly significant drought period. And so some of my colleagues have referred to the year 2011 as the poster child for climate change. It's just some of the extremes that we can expect to experience as we go forward. So how are these changes that we're expecting and projecting to see in Canadian prairie climate going to affect prairie wetlands? Now, I'm going to focus on prairie wetlands, and the image I'm showing here is essentially of a seasonal prairie wetland in the hemi-marsh stage, and this is going to be important because this is really the productive type of habitat we're interested in. Now, I'm focusing on these small prairie wetlands because to do a climate change talk on wetlands in general would be extremely extensive in terms of covering the different types of wetlands from coastal estuaries and salt marshes to boreal peatlands and Arctic tundra. So we're focusing on temperate prairie wetlands, given that this is prairie, it's got the goods week. So just for a little bit of background, obviously the region that Ducks Unlimited Canada is most interested in is the prairie pothole region. And again, this encompasses essentially the entire prairie ecozone of Canada. And so the prairie pothole region encompasses approximately 777,000 square kilometers, extending down into Iowa all the way into Alberta. Contains roughly between 5 to 8 million wetlands that fluctuates fairly dramatically annually based on precipitation. And it spans a moisture gradient of anywhere from 300 to 900 millimeters and a temperature gradient with a very dramatic climate, essentially going from drought to deluge, as previously discussed, and from temperatures ranging from minus 40 degrees Celsius to 40 degrees Celsius. Now, we also know that this region is absolutely vital to North America's waterfowl populations, and it's increasingly recognized for the ecosystem services offered by its numerous wetlands. Now, unfortunately, these systems are often overlooked, and that's because of their small stature. Now, when we look at an image like this, looking essentially at a landscape in the prairie pothole region, one can quickly see how the combination and the complex of these systems can become quite important regionally. So while any one of these wetlands can be fairly small, and in fact the average size is under half a hectare, when you have numerous wetland basins like this accumulating on a landscape, they can play a fairly significant role in a number of different ecosystem services. And so I'm going to refer to another term we often use with prairie pothole wetlands and these small prairie pothole landscapes is geographically isolated wetlands. And so I'm just going to briefly cover quickly how this landscape was formed and how geographically isolated wetlands are formed. And so essentially, roughly 12,000 years ago, when the ice sheet started to retreat, they left behind big blocks of ice in the outwash plain, essentially in the sediment produced from these glaciers. Once these ice blocks melt, they form essentially what is the kettle hole, kettle lake, and here in the Canadian prairies and North American prairie pothole region, we refer to those as pothole lakes. So why are these prairie wetlands special? So again, these are mostly non-floodplain wetlands, geographically isolated. That means that they lack bidirectional hydrologic connections with adjacent streams and or rivers. And these systems are often embedded in uplands and without well-defined surface inlets or outlets. Now again, obviously, especially here in the prairie region, wetlands are often situated in working agricultural landscapes where land use change and drainage impact wetland functions. And they're particularly vulnerable to climate change because unlike completely terrestrial ecosystems, whether it's grasslands or forests, prairie potholes cannot migrate with a changing climate. And that's because they are essentially present because of topographic features that cannot migrate along with climate change. So one of the main drivers of these prairie wetland ecosystems and indicators of their health is what we call hydroperiod. And so really prairie wetland hydroperiod or hydroperiod is just the length of time that a wetland is inundated. This is largely regulated by the balance between precipitation and evapotranspiration. These really are the important mechanisms in the prairies because we do not have extensive groundwater, or at least deep groundwater exchange through most of these prairie wetlands. It also controls wetland productivity and the types of biota that can be supported in these wetlands, and really determines the suitability for species. And so we know that 100 days is essentially required for many waterfowl, amphibian, and aquatic invertebrates. Now, in addition to hydroperiod, another important facet to consider in terms of these prairie wetlands is the wetland cover cycle. And so on the left here is a figure taken from Werner in 2013, but this is a well understood cover cycle that occurs in prairie wetlands throughout the prairie ecozone. And essentially what we see is that under normal rainfall conditions, we produce these regenerating marsh phases, essentially where we produce hemi-marsh habitat. And what that means is essentially we have a fairly good interspersion of emergent wetland vegetation and open water, which essentially maximizes production for waterfowl, the invertebrates that use those systems, as well as other ecosystem services. Now we can cycle through that system essentially as water levels start to increase. We'll enter into a degenerating marsh phase, essentially, but that is still considered hemi-marsh. And then we eventually enter into a lake phase, and then after a drought, we can enter into this dry marsh phase. And we can see that these changes in wetland cover cycle are obviously clearly linked to wetland hydroperiod. And so on the right-hand side here, we have an example of what hydroperiods look like for different types of wetlands. And so in the blue, we have a semi-permanent wetland versus the green, which is a seasonal wetland, and the red, which is a temporary wetland. And essentially what I'm trying to highlight with this figure is that the hemi-marsh phase is really maximized in these seasonal wetlands where we're producing the most hemi-marsh habitat. Okay, Now, important is that in the Canadian prairies, as I said, climate change is expected to increase temperature and evapotranspiration while only minimally increasing annual precipitation. And therefore, the balance between precipitation and evapotranspiration is expected to result in larger water deficits for prairie wetlands. And again, this is just an example of some figures for the prairie pothole region, essentially looking at growing degree days in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, where we can see these fairly significant increases in temperature, even more significant increases in evapotranspiration, and unfortunately not a corresponding dramatic increase in precipitation. And in fact, during the summer, likely entering into these deficit areas. And so this has significant implications, obviously, for wetland hydroperiod. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the presentation to catch up with my clicks. There we go. Sorry about that, folks. So obviously, those changes are going to have important impacts to wetland hydroperiod. One of the main ones being that water depth and duration of a given water depth is predicted to decline significantly across all wetland classes, but specifically in semi-permanent and seasonal wetlands. And essentially what we can see is that there's going to be changes in the distribution of these classes of wetlands, where semi-permanent are going to wind up looking more like seasonal wetlands, and seasonal wetlands are going to wind up looking more like temporary wetlands. Now, where this really gets interesting and challenging is that in seasonal wetlands, a hydroperiod of 100 days, if we look at some of the modeling work that's come out of the Dakotas, seasonal wetland with a hydroperiod of 100 days occurred in 22 out of 100 years under historical conditions. Now, going forward, this is going to be reduced by 68% for a climate that is roughly 2 degrees Celsius warmer, and by as much as 95% for a climate that is 4 degrees Celsius warmer. And so this has really serious implications for species that require longer hydroperiods and may result in ecological trap effects. And what I mean by that is that we know that dabbling ducks essentially require a hydroperiod of 100 days so they can select a wetland and essentially hatch their young and fledge them. Now, what can happen under these changing climates is if that hydroperiod changes significantly, a waterfowl species or another species could select a wetland based on the spring conditions, only to have that wetland dry up unexpectedly, resulting in negative impacts to waterfowl and other species that use these prairie wetlands. Now, in addition to affecting hydroperiods, changing climates are also going to impact the wetland cover cycle. And so this is just looking again at some work from the Dakotas out of Carter Johnson's group at the University of South Dakota, where they simulated percentage of emergent cover and open water for different regions across the prairies, and looked at the impacts of climate change. And essentially what happens is as climate changes and it warms, we see that these systems become progressively more closed. So essentially we lose that hemi-marsh state, dry out these systems, and they become choked with emergent vegetation again, which isn't necessarily attractive to species like waterfowl, and is going to have ramifications for other wetland-dependent species as well. Now, when Carter Johnson's group puts this all together, they're able to simulate maps like these to essentially look at the occurrence of highly favorable water and cover conditions for waterfowl breeding across the prairie pothole region under current or historic climates, and then looking at some of the alternatives in the future. And what we see is the changes in availability, suitability of habitat may potentially reduce waterfowl populations by 30 to 70% below historical average. Now, what's important to note here is that these changes do not incorporate potential land use changes. So, example, switchovers from grassland to crop or perennial cover to croplands that we know are going to accompany climate change. And they also don't account for some of the resulting impacts to wetlands, such as increased drainage and reduced quality of remaining wetlands. So we know that as climate changes and there's additional pressure to potentially convert landscapes to other forms of crops, there's also going to be heightened pressure on wetlands and changes to the landscape surrounding them. And so one thing that we need to consider here is that there is significant pressure occurring to this date on remaining wetland-rich landscapes throughout the Canadian prairies. This is a map essentially looking at cumulative ditching intensity for the prairie ecozone that was compiled by Mike Watmow with the Canadian Wildlife Service. And again, what we can see in a map like this is we can see that the highest ditching pressure essentially occurs in this region, essentially fringing the prairie ecozone, associated with dark gray and black soil zones. This also happens to be some of the most wetland dense habitat within the prairie ecozone. So we can see that there's ongoing pressure on those landscapes. And in fact, we can look at some examples from across the prairies. The next slide I'm going to show, once it catches up here, is from some work that we've done in southwestern Manitoba in the Britons Creek watershed. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the slide to catch up here.
Yeah, it seems we have a bit of a lag today.
Yeah, so are you still seeing the map with the cumulative ditching?
Yes.
Okay. I think one of the issues is as soon as I try to use the pointer, that seems to slow things down. So I might stop using the pointer. Hopefully the slide will change soon.
Okay.
It still seems like it's stuck.
Yeah.
Sorry, folks. Bear with us for a minute or so here. Hopefully we'll get this back on track. Any suggestions, Caitlin, on potentially remedying this? I can always close the presentation and restart it.
Yeah, we could try that. I'm not sure if it's like heavy graphics on your end and it's the PowerPoint itself or the webinar technology. I don't have a remedy on my end though that I can think of at the moment.
Well, you know what? It looks like it's changed. Again, I apologize. I will try not to use the laser pointer feature because it seems that that's when this tends to go awry. So again, I just wanted to highlight that you know, in light of climate change, we also have to understand that these landscapes have undergone significant change historically. And so this is looking at the Britons Creek watershed, the northeast corner of the Britons Creek watershed in 1968. You can see all the blue areas representing intact wetlands. You can see the red lines representing some of the drains that were already present on the landscape in 1968. And you can see a few of these red cross-hatched areas representing drained wetlands. Now, when we jump ahead to 2005, you can see that through our change detection analysis, we're able to identify that virtually, you know, 80 to 90% of that landscape has been impacted by drainage, with at least in this portion of the watershed, most of the wetlands being lost. And then you can also see some of the other wetlands that have grown in size through consolidation. Now, throughout the entire Britons Creek watershed, that's resulted in about a 21% reduction in wetland area, but 69% of the wetland basins have been lost or degraded. And so that means that to some extent, they have been affected by drainage. Now that's really important because if you have 70% of the wetlands already affected by drainage, essentially there's a ditch on the wetland footprint might still be there, but there's a ditch that is controlling the water levels. Those ones are going to be particularly sensitive and impacted by any further changes to hydroperiod. And when we look across the entire prairie pothole region of Canada, we know that there are a significant amount of wetlands lost in developed areas. And so one example I often give is southern Manitoba between the city of Winnipeg and the border with North Dakota. In that region of the prairies alone, we've lost in excess of 90% of historical wetland extent. And then if we look at more recent loss, essentially over the last 60 years between Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and other agricultural regions like southern Ontario, in the last 60 years alone, we've lost about 665,000 hectares of wetlands. And again, most of that coming from the prairie ecozone. So just to summarize some of the climate change impacts on prairie wetlands, obviously we're going to see increases in temperature, reduced water availability, and this is going to produce changes to hydroperiods and alter the cover cycle. And just for context here, the image on the left is actually taken from the Smith Creek watershed from 1958 to 2008. And so the talk that John Patterson is going to be giving this afternoon is focusing on this watershed. But again, here you can see how dramatic of an impact we've had on those landscapes through removing wetlands and conversion to productive landscapes. So obviously the result of past pressures applied to wetland landscapes, such as we see in the PPR, are likely going to amplify the effects of climate change in these regions. And there's actually now concern that in combination, these could result in an ecological threshold or tipping point where we see rapid loss and disappearance of these wetlands across the prairie pothole region. And these types of changes are often, as I said, rapid and irreversible. So once you cross these tipping points and thresholds, it's usually very difficult to go back and try to restore. So I'm going to switch gears for the next half of the presentation and really talk about the role of prairie wetlands in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And so from a global perspective, wetlands store approximately 30% of terrestrial carbon, but only occupy 5 to 8% of the landscape. Now, most of that carbon is locked up in northern peatlands. But again, it's just to highlight how important wetlands are in the terrestrial carbon cycle globally. And we also know that wetlands are among the most productive ecosystems in the world. And of the many various types of wetlands that we find, inland freshwater marshes have some of the highest rates of net primary productivity, so ranging from anywhere from 250 to almost 3,000 grams of carbon per meter square per year. Now, we also know that wetlands are important global carbon stores, but also important sources of greenhouse gases. However, it's important to note that while wetlands do produce potent greenhouse gases like methane, no natural wetlands, essentially older than 250 years, can really be considered net sources of radiative forcing or essentially warming, because those are really part of the pre-industrial baseline conditions. So those wetlands have existed on the landscape for hundreds of years, if not millennia, and they've been releasing methane that entire time. And in fact, they're partially responsible for the atmosphere that we enjoy today. So they're not really part of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas issue. Now, another thing to highlight here is that while wetlands are, the largest natural source of methane to the atmosphere, it's important to note the regional differences here. So most of the methane produced from wetlands that we find in the atmosphere actually comes from tropical regions. Now, that's not to say that northern peatlands are not important, but again, looking at this figure, you can see that wetlands centered on the equator are producing most of the methane that's winding up in the atmosphere. We also do have significant contributions in more temperate latitudes, and again, the next figure will show that these are mostly associated with boreal peatlands that we find here in Canada. So again, this map is just showing that some of the more important sources of methane within North America. You can see the green areas associated with livestock, the red areas associated with oil and gas, and some of the blue checkers associated with waste. And you can see the gray areas that are tagged to wetlands. And again, what you can see is that there's essentially no gray in the prairie ecozone. Essentially, if we're looking at southwestern Manitoba to southern Saskatchewan and Alberta, we don't see any significant wetland methane emissions from that region. They seem to be mostly produced by the extensive wetland areas that we do find in boreal regions. And again, you can see that highlighted by the gray areas in northwestern Ontario, central Manitoba, and again, along the boreal transition zone in Saskatchewan and Alberta. So when I first started at Ducks Limited Canada, one of the projects that we were working on was essentially trying to quantify whether prairie wetlands were acting as greenhouse gas sinks or sources. And we were interested because obviously we're involved with wetland restorations, and we wanted to be able to determine whether restorations have the potential to offset some of the carbon that's entering into the atmosphere. Now, as I mentioned earlier, wetlands are among the most productive ecosystems, and especially the freshwater emergent marshes that we're interested in. But the same reasons that make those systems highly productive also result in conditions that are very favorable for methane production. So as soon as you have high organic matter content with low oxygen and essentially anaerobic conditions, you favor methanogenesis and the production of methane. And so we set out actually at that time under the direction of Dr. Rhonda McDougall, who previously worked with Ducks Limited Canada, to try and quantify greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration associated with wetland restoration in the Canadian prairies. And so Ducks Limited Canada and its partners monitored over 60 wetlands across the Canadian PPR, essentially extending from southwestern Manitoba up to areas around Edmonton. And at all of these sites, we measured soil organic carbon and greenhouse gas emissions for the three main greenhouse gases, focusing on CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. And we measured these across landscape transects, essentially going from the uplands surrounding wetlands down into the wetland basin centers themselves. Now, what we found is that carbon stores were highest in intact wetlands and increased with restoration age, and were significantly higher in wetlands relative to uplands. So generally across these landscapes, we found that wetlands were storing roughly twice the amount of carbon that their adjacent uplands were storing. Now, even after we accounted for methane emissions at these sites, we were predicting that wetland restoration was sequestering approximately 3.25 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per hectare per year. Now, one of the other things we were able to identify through this study was that wetland drainage was likely resulting in a loss of about 89 tons of soil organic carbon per hectare. So once you convert those systems, there's a fairly substantial loss of soil organic carbon that's emitted back to the atmosphere as CO2. And this research is actually referenced in the 2013 IPCC supplement on greenhouse gas inventories focused on wetlands. Now, we think that this is important because what it really indicates is that wetland drainage is offsetting some of the other climate change investments that we're making throughout the prairie region. So when we compile and add all these numbers together and look at wetland loss in the Canadian prairies over the last 60 years, we estimate that wetland drainage has resulted in the loss of about 43 million tons of carbon that was previously stored in sediment and vegetation back to the atmosphere. And so that's equivalent to the emissions of approximately 1.5 million cars over 20 years. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is, can we manage some of the wetlands in these agricultural landscapes to help mitigate climate change? So we're pretty sure that we can restore wetlands and return carbon back to the soil. But what about the wetlands that still exist in these landscapes, especially in agricultural regions? Are there things that we can do to help reduce some of the emissions that we know come from these systems? And so one of the important things, and this is well documented right around the world, but again also here in the prairies, is that there is a clear link between methane emissions and water chemistry, especially in this case with sulfate. So as sulfate concentrations increase, we usually see a corresponding decrease in wetland emissions. And that's essentially because as you have higher sulfate concentrations, methanogenesis is not as favored as a reaction. And so, in fact, we often see fairly substantial high sulfate concentrations in prairie wetlands. And so is there a mechanism where we can favor or select or specifically conserve and work with wetlands that we know are going to have lower methane emissions relative to other wetlands where methane emissions might be higher under low sulfate concentrations? Now, we also know that there's a pretty good relationship between the trophic status of wetlands and methane emissions. And so again, here I'm just showing a relationship between orthophosphorus, or essentially soluble phosphorus that's available to algal and plants in the water column relative to methane emissions. And as those concentrations of phosphorus increase and essentially water column productivity, we can see that wetland methane emissions increase correspondingly. And so that's really important. So that indicates that as we kind of eutrophie or enrich wetlands with nutrients, we're potentially increasing wetland methane emissions, which means that correspondingly, if we're able to decrease nutrient loading to these systems, we should be able to reduce methane emissions. And so this next slide really just shows the really vast difference that we see when we have wetlands embedded in pasture, grassland, perennial cover versus those in cropland. And so again, this is some data taken from southwestern Manitoba and east central Saskatchewan in the Britons Creek watershed and the Smith Creek watershed, where we looked at 31 wetlands, 17 of them embedded in cropland, another 14 embedded in pasture and grassland, and looked at mean concentrations of phosphorus. And we can see that the mean concentration for wetlands embedded in cropland is roughly 3 times higher than those that we see in grass pasture systems. Even more importantly is if we look at the median concentration, we see that there's a 40-fold difference in those, where the median concentrations is essentially 40 times lower for pasture, grassland, wetlands relative to those embedded in cropland. And so this would again suggest that by simply potentially restoring some of the uplands around these wetland systems and converting perhaps a buffer to perennial cover, we might be able to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions by lowering the nutrient concentrations entering the systems. And this next slide, again, kind of highlights the relationship between eutrophication and nutrient enrichment and methane emissions in these systems. Now, this isn't, in fact, from natural wetlands. These are from constructed wetlands in the city of Winnipeg compared to some conventional stormwater retention basins. But again, what it shows is that in these fairly small, shallow aquatic communities, there's a pretty good relationship between productivity here measured as chlorophyll A, so essentially phytoplankton, and cumulative greenhouse gas emissions from these sites. So as they become more productive, that algal material is being converted readily, easily consumed, and producing anoxic conditions, resulting in higher methane conditions. And in fact, we think that there's probably a clear link with some of the cyanobacterial blooms that we see at high nutrient loading, because you can see that on the figure on the right-hand side, there's a fairly distinct cutoff that once we get below the red-fuel ratio of 16:1, essentially where blue-green algae or cyanobacteria are favored, that's where we see a pretty dramatic increase in cumulative methane emissions across these sites. Now, again, none of this should be surprising because there is fairly well-documented interactions between climate change and eutrophication. And it's essentially been referred to as an allied attack by Brian Moss. And what this is showing is essentially that in these shallow systems and in these shallow wetland systems, warming is going to potentially result in more nutrients entering those systems. It's going to favor the production of cyanobacterial blooms. These are going to result in lower oxygen, higher organic matter sedimentation rates, and essentially those wind up producing greater methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions. And then you get into this negative feedback cycle. And so while this is the case for wetlands, this is also true of lakes, and it also speaks to some of the co-benefits offered by wetlands, that wetlands do a really good job at preventing further downstream nutrient loading and are in fact fairly well equipped to deal with high nutrient loading. And so while we can avoid high methane emissions by reducing nutrient loading to wetlands, having wetlands on the landscape also prevents additional nutrient loading to downstream water bodies, where that nutrient loading might also produce additional greenhouse gases. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the other vegetation that we see in these prairie wetlands, and this is one that I'm sure everyone who's familiar with prairies has seen, but we don't talk about an awful lot. And so this is just some data looking at the effects of algal mats, essentially metaphyton, on greenhouse gas fluxes. And so again, in hemi-marsh systems, we often find these fairly dense mats of phytoplankton. And when I first started with duck limited, I was curious to see essentially what they would do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And so this figure is just essentially looking at the combination of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions from a transect that we did across a pond, extending from where the mat was occurring to the mat edge to the open water, and then expressing those greenhouse gas emissions as a CO2 equivalent. And what you can see is that those algal mats have a fairly significant impact on methane emissions and cumulative emissions from these wetlands. They're really productive and they produce really high oxygen environments. And so any methane that's produced there is actually going to be rapidly oxidized and likely not hit the atmosphere. And so we can in fact see that these mats are consuming significant amounts of CO2 throughout the day and only emitting likely overnight. Now, we were also involved with some work with Dr. Richard Grossens at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where we wanted to look at the impact of cattail harvesting in certain systems and what that would do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this also gave us the opportunity to look at different ways of measuring greenhouse gases. So historically, we used fairly small flux chambers, which was the standard, but those were dark opaque chambers that didn't allow light to penetrate and really didn't allow you to accommodate vegetation. So we wanted to try using these fairly large telescopic chambers that we could use that were clear, so it would allow sunlight to penetrate, and that we could use to accommodate wetland vegetation. And when we did that, we saw pretty dramatic CO2 uptake in those chambers, where those stands of cattail are taking up fairly significant amounts of CO2 throughout the growing season. And then switching over to slight sources, starting in September, you can see the correlation as the temperature drops and those plants start to senesce. They start actually emitting CO2 as opposed to taking it up. Now, we also looked at methane emissions in those systems, and they were fairly low with the except of the short spring flood period, summer flood period, where we saw fairly rapid methane increases. Again, what was interesting here is that we saw much larger methane increases in non-harvested cattail stands relative to the harvested cattail stands. And when we put all the greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide together, at least what we find looking at daytime emissions is that those cattail stands are in fact taking up a significant amount of greenhouse gases as CO2 equivalents, and in fact that the harvested stands were performing better than the non-harvested stands. Now, we did not conduct these measurements on a diurnal scale, so a lot of this uptake is going to be offset by nighttime respiration, but it indicates that you can potentially manage vegetation communities in prairie wetlands to either maximize carbon uptake or minimize greenhouse gas emissions. So the last part of this talk is going to focus on how wetlands help buffer against the impacts of climate change. And the first slide I want to look at here is one comparing essentially the solar input to a drained landscape versus a landscape that still includes wetlands. And so what we're seeing on this figure is that the drained landscape on the left, as it is accumulating or being exposed to solar energy, most of that is being converted to sensible heat. So that's the type of heat that you and I can feel on our skin. So it's essentially producing a warming of the local atmosphere. Whereas the intact landscape, where we still have water on the landscape and existing wetlands, most of that solar energy is being dissipated through evapotranspiration, and so it's being converted to latent heat. And so those can really have significant effects, and so essentially resulting in a cooling and humidifying of the regional landscape. And in fact, this has been commonly found in a number of modeling studies. And so this is just highlighting a few from Bonin in 1995 to Krinner in 2003, and some additional work by Mishra. And so essentially, it becomes really important to account for wetlands on the landscape, because these modeling exercises do show that they are producing a cooling, humidifying effect. And so the models generally find that wetlands are increasing regional evapotranspiration, that they're increasing regional latent heat flux, that they're decreasing sensible heat flux, and in many cases producing summer cooling, particularly in the month of July, of anywhere from 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, and that these have the potential to alter regional precipitation patterns. And so this is really important, again, knowing that changes to temperature and hydroperiods are really going to have an impact on prairie wetlands. Now, this is some data that we pulled together fairly quickly, just to look, because I was interested in whether we would actually see then in the Canadian prairies any signal in our climate records based on wetland density, wetland cover throughout the prairie ecozone. And so what we did here is we looked at the relationship between daily average temp, essentially climate normals, and daily maximum temp for 64 climate stations spanning the entire prairie pothole region in Canada. We then buffered those climate stations with a 50-kilometer radius and looked at wetland cover in the regions around those climate stations. And then we essentially modeled the impact, and we essentially corrected for longitude and latitude, knowing that there's going to be climate differences as we move from south to north, and precipitation differences as we move from west to east. And so after we have corrected for differences in longitude and latitude, we can see that there's a pretty strong signal that as wetland cover increases across those landscapes, across those climate stations, we see that daily average mean temperature and daily maximum temperature drop by almost a full degree Celsius. And so again, this just shows the importance of these small wetlands, but knowing that there's many of them on the landscape, that they are having this regional impact on climate. Now, we also know that wetland loss has negative consequences for groundwater and soil moisture. And again, this comes back to some of the drought effects. And once you start drying a landscape, it becomes progressively more challenging to recover from drought. But we know that when we lose these systems, we have negative consequences for groundwater and soil moisture. And this is covered in a recent paper by Amelie and Creed. But then we also know that from some of the more recent modeling work that inclusion of groundwater and soil moisture in climate models is important. It essentially eliminates some of the warm summer bias, or essentially results in a cooling effect. So again, by losing wetlands at the landscape scale and impacting groundwater and soil moisture, again, we're likely producing a warming effect. And by keeping those on the landscape, conversely, we have a cooling effect on regional atmosphere. And so to end off with, I was going to put together a list of summary and conclusions on my own, but I figured what I would do is just share what the Ramsar Convention has put out, because they're fairly in line with exactly what I would recommend we need to consider in the prairie ecoregion for small prairie wetlands. And so what Ramsar has stated is that the wise use and restoration of wetlands is essential to protect stored carbon and reduce avoidable carbon emissions. And again, that has been confirmed by some of our research. We see that there's fairly large changes in soil organic carbon as we convert wetlands to other uses. We can prioritize wetland protection and restoration to enhance the climate adaptation and resilience. Again, we know that wetlands provide a whole host of other co-benefits in terms of flood attenuation and mitigating non-point source nutrient pollution. We also know that wetlands play a vital role in retaining water on the landscape, maintaining local climate and water cycles, and reducing temperature extremes. And again, that is well documented in models, and also seems to be present in the data that we've worked on here for the Canadian prairies. Fourthly, as I mentioned, protecting and restoring wetlands increases climate mitigation and resilience and delivers many co-benefits. So in addition to flood mitigation and mitigating non-point source nutrient pollution, wetlands also help buffer, obviously, against drought and help sustain local biodiversity. And then lastly, protecting and restoring wetlands for climate mitigation and adaptation represents progress towards meeting sustainable development goals. And so obviously through the Paris Agreement on climate change, Canada and some of the provinces have various commitments to meet those goals. And with that, I am happy to take any questions from the group.
Thank you so much. That was a really awesome presentation and very, very informative. One of our listeners here has written into that this is awesome, just great knowledge. So thank you very much for the detailed presentation today. To all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions, please feel free to type it into the webinar section of the webinar dashboard. Yeah, a few people are writing in. Thank you very much. So we have a couple questions, Pascal, if you're okay with that.
Yep.
A listener named Laura would like to know, do you see newly suitable wetland habitat emerging with climate change, perhaps in the forest fringe?
That is a tough question to answer, because the specific types of wetlands I'm talking about are really controlled by topography. So if the topography is there, essentially a depressional landscape, and we change precipitation patterns to shift the water balance, that there's going to be an accumulation on the landscape, it is possible that we could see emergence of new wetlands. I mean, they tend to be pretty dynamic. What I would say, though, is that given the variability in climate already and some of the precipitation extremes, we would have expected to already detect some of those changes. So, for example, we would have likely seen in some flood years expansion of those systems. And I don't know that we're necessarily seeing the formation of new wetlands specifically in the boreal transition zone. And in fact, that's one of the regions where under climate change scenarios, we would expect that there would be an increased pressure in terms of landscape conversion. So we already see slow chipping away in the boreal transition zone. conversion to agricultural production, under climate change scenarios, I would expect those to ramp up quite significantly.
Thank you for that answer. Our next question is by a listener named Dave. What further research is required in Saskatchewan to better define the carbon management value of retaining and restoring wetlands on croplands?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one of the issues we have with prairie wetlands is that there is essentially no long-term monitoring network for these systems. So when we're talking about forest landscapes, cropland landscapes, rivers, lakes, all of those systems have a fairly good monitoring network with long-term data sets that really help inform how those systems perform in terms of carbon sinks, carbon sources. The study we ran was for 3 to 4 years in a couple of different regions. Having a more expansive network of wetlands to sample and look at consistently from year to year would go a long way in understanding, the full cycle in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration associated with these small prairie wetlands.
Thanks for that answer. A listener named Joanne says, this is great information and all of Canada should be aware of this. How can we get them to refocus on the media overplaying of other topics? And I guess the next part of our question is, what did you do with the material harvested from the wetlands in this study? Do they just decompose and just not within the study area?
Yeah, so actually that's a great question. So there's 2 parts to that question. The first one, I think a lot of people are starting to realize the value and the benefits associated with wetlands and small wetlands. We know that small wetlands, in fact, do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of processing nutrients and biological function. And I think there's a lot of good research and people working on that, and I think it's becoming more widely accepted, and we just need to keep on sharing that information in a way that's consumable to policymakers and the general public. Now, the second part of that question was related to the cattail harvesting project that we were involved with, and that was actually quite innovative. So that cattail was being harvested and then pelletized, and a local hydrolite community was using it to essentially heat some of their structures. And so again, we were offsetting, depending on where the heat was coming from, could be coal, could be natural gas. But again, we were offsetting other greenhouse gas emissions by essentially using that local biofuel to heat barns.
Oh,
and again, Dr. Richard Grossens with the International Institute for Sustainable Development was really the one leading that project and would be the best to answer it and provide any additional details if the person asking the question is interested.
Thanks. So I guess just to confirm, in terms of getting the messages to the public and policymakers about wetland drainage, do you think that we need more research, or is it more of a matter of just getting the message out there better?
Well, so you put me in an awkward position because I'm a research scientist, so I always want to do more research. Now, having said that, there is no reason why we cannot be making decisions today based on the information we have in hand. And so Ducks Unlimited as an organization is strongly committed to adaptive management. And so, we will always conduct research. We'll always look to improve the information that we're gathering, but that should not prevent us from making decisions today. And so I think there's lots of information available for us to convince policymakers and the public on the importance of wetland, but realizing that we're also entering in a really dynamic period for the human race in terms of, we have changes in climate, we have, increasing land use pressures, we have a whole host of chemicals on the landscape and other changes in terms of invasive species. And so understanding how all of those interact is going to be important going forward. And again, that kind of plugs in to the earlier question on having a long-term monitoring network for these systems.
Thanks for that answer. A listener named Majid would like to know if you have ever studied, or do you know any suggestions about how to understand the connections between GIWs in terms of water quantity and quality?
Yeah, so in fact, there is a number of groups working exactly on that issue. So Dr. John Pomeroy and Dr. Kevin Shook out of the University of Saskatchewan have been working for a number of years on the cold regions hydrologic model that is specifically designed to try and address how prairie wetlands affect water quantity and flows in the prairie landscape. Dr. Heather Golden with the USGS has been working on these issues as well as Dr. Irina Creed with the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan, Genevieve Lee, now with, I believe, the University of Guelph. Also very interested in geographically isolated wetlands and its role in terms of regulating water quantity and quality. And in fact, we have run a number of programs, both in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, as well as in Alberta, looking at these small isolated wetlands and what happens when you connect up the landscape in terms of contributing areas. And there's pretty substantial body of literature and available data that shows that as we connect the landscape and drain these small isolated wetlands, we're having a disproportionately large effect on contributing areas, which is increasing water yields, peak flows, and along with that, the nutrients that come off the landscape.
Thanks for that answer. There's a question here from a listener named Jeff, and it's pretty long, so I'm just going to send it to you as well if that's easier. He says that temporary wetlands are more vulnerable to drainage and cultivation than seasonal or semi-permanent. So what impact will climate change have on farmer decisions regarding drainage? And will climate variation make farming economically increasingly unsustainable because of increased crop failure risk, taking pressure off wetlands and pushing system back toward ranching and mixed farming? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer all of the components of it. So a lot of the presentation I gave focused essentially on semi-permanent and seasonal wetlands. And so in terms of the remaining area of wetlands in the prairies, it's largely dominated by seasonal wetlands and semi-permanent wetlands. And that is not to downplay the value of the more ephemeral and temporary wetlands, but for the most part, where those exist, they have been converted. So there isn't a whole host of seasonal and ephemeral wetlands that remain on the landscape. And again, what we're trying to quantify with some of the work that we're doing is that, in fact, these prairie wetlands can be of value to agricultural producers. So they will maintain soil moisture conditions and local groundwater tables. They will help avoid some of the heat stress that crops might face. Additionally, they're going to have a role in terms of regional precipitation. So if you dry out a landscape, often what happens is you don't have evapotranspiration contributing moisture back to the atmosphere, which then falls as rain. That moisture just leaves. So there's a whole bunch of confounding issues that make it very complicated. But again, I think trying to work with what we would call natural infrastructure and keeping these wetlands on the landscape is only going to pay dividends for landowners down the road. There's also a pretty substantial move with a lot of industry groups now to embrace kind of a no new land in production model, that we should be farming the best land and maximizing production there. And then in these other areas, wetlands often being considered marginal, that we leave those to provide the ecosystem services, often ecosystem services that can be a benefit to landowners. I know there's recent work essentially looking at pollinators associated with wetland habitat, and we can see that native bee species, in fact, are fairly abundant around wetland habitats and decrease as you move into cropland environments.
Wow, thanks for that answer. A question here from a listener named Mike. Are you familiar with any studies relating terrestrial habitat loss with wetland loss, and particularly related to the effects of evapotranspiration and potentially increased winds throughout the prairies, parklands, and boreal transition zone? People talk about how much windier it is now compared to 40 or 50 years ago.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I don't know if I have a succinct answer. I actually have not really heard a great deal on changes in wind speed and or direction across Canadian prairies. That's not to say that it's not happening. Now, again, what happens is as you convert landscapes from natural systems where you either have grasses, trees, and or wetlands to croplands, you really reduce surface roughness. And so, you know, that all has an effect in terms of how the local atmosphere is going to respond to future changes in climate.
Thanks. A listener named Chelsea would like to know, will you partner more with Dr. Grosshands for future research on phytoremediation and wetland ecology?
Yes, great question. We collaborate with Dr. Grosshands and IISD on a number of projects. In fact, they're interested in looking at other water retention projects in southeastern Manitoba and how those can be managed essentially to maximize water quality and water quantity benefits.
Thanks. A listener named Alex would like to know, a very interesting presentation, thank you. And his question is, have you been involved in any research that investigates the effects of farming activities and practices on existing wetlands in the White Zone region of Alberta?
So we actually ran a watershed project in the Camrose Creek watershed, again, where we looked at the distribution of wetlands, wetland drainage, and water quality. And actually, it's an interesting case study because so in that watershed in Alberta, the landscape is actually fairly intact in terms of drainage. That's to say that while some wetlands have been lost, we haven't seen the same type of wetland drainage resulting in changes to contributing area that we have seen, for example, in Smith Creek in Saskatchewan or Britons Creek in Manitoba. And so the results are actually substantially different. We don't, in the Camrose Creek watershed, we don't see these kind of corresponding increases in non-point source nutrient pollution and large increases in water yield because that landscape is still actually contains a significant amount of wetlands and has a significant storage capacity, and so is buffering the landscape from experiencing increases in discharge and nutrient pollution. Whereas some of the other watersheds where we have seen more extensive drainage, the opposite is true.
Thanks for that answer. A listener named Joanne says, how do we as a society regard agricultural producers for not draining wetlands?
That is another great question, and we have thought about this long and hard. And so the last thing, you know, I want to be seen as doing is really pointing the finger at an agricultural producer. I mean, I think we can all agree that we are absolutely dependent on agriculture. You know, there's no doubt about that. And maybe what it comes down to is having the type of pressure to develop certification systems similar to what we've seen in forestry as well as fisheries, where, you know, if a landowner is going to commit to that type of sustainable practice, that they're offered essentially a premium for their product. And I think that would likely go a long way to acknowledging the role that landowners play in stewarding the environment.
Thanks. A listener named Stephen would like to know, how has the loss of prairie potholes affected groundwater quality and abundance?
Great question. Unfortunately, I will not have a great answer. So when we talk about small prairie wetlands, we usually generalize, and for the most part, they're considered not to have significant groundwater interaction. That is not to say that that's always the case, because they're usually underlain by fairly heavy clay. Often we don't see large groundwater connections. Now, that's not to say that there aren't important subsurface, shallow groundwater connections. So what I would say is that, again, a lot of those questions would be addressed if we had kind of a suitable monitoring network. But for the most part, we don't have consistent information collected for those types of wetlands across the prairies. There are a few sites. So, for example, St. Denis Wildlife Area near Saskatchewan, where we have long-term data sets on these types of wetlands. But again, as we move forward and as the climate is changing, I think it's going to become very important to look at those questions. And one example I can give is, for example, at Smith Creek in Saskatchewan, in the 50s, before most of that landscape was converted and most of the wetlands were lost, there was essentially no flow during the summer period. Most of that water stayed on the landscape. You compare that to some of the shifts that we've seen. Granted, some of it is due to changes in precipitation patterns, but I believe it was in the year 2014 that peak flow was actually recorded in August. And so it's the first time in that watershed that we've seen essentially the hydrograph completely shift from a spring-dominated season to a summer rainfall event. And so all of that is going to have important ramifications for soil moisture and groundwater, local groundwater.
Thanks for that answer. There's a comment here from a listener named Erica that says, just a big thank you for the informative presentation. The science and implications were very clearly explained. So I think that's a good way to finish. Thank you again. We've had a couple requests from listeners to see if it'd be possible to download the presentation. Normally we upload them to the YouTube channel, but Pascal, I know there's lots of detail in yours. Would it be possible to put a PDF format on the PCAP website?
Yeah, I think that's totally acceptable.
Okay, excellent. I'll touch base with you afterwards then about that. And to all of our listeners, you can check out the PCAP YouTube channel for a recording of this as well. So I guess with that, thank you listeners for tuning in today. We had a great turnout. And we'd just like to ask everyone, if you don't mind taking a minute to fill out the quick 1-minute survey that'll pop up when you leave. We really appreciate your help in reporting back statistics to our funders. So thank you everyone for tuning in today, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, Pascal.
Thanks all, and I apologize for some of the technical difficulties.
Yeah, I think it was the webinar technology this time. So thank you.